The paper in Anna Easton's hand was shaking, and it was not from the wind that cut through the cracks of Stephen Underwood's office door. It was from what he had just said to her. "A partnership," he repeated, and the word landed in the air between them like a struck match. "Not employment, Mrs. Easton. A partnership. Equal shares in everything the Double Creek Ranch produces from this day forward." Anna stared at him. Her jaw was tight. Her dark eyes, still carrying the shadows of 2 years of grief and 1 year of desperate survival, were wide and burning with something she could not name. She had walked through that door 40 minutes ago with a rehearsed speech, a folded letter of reference from a mercantile owner in Laredo, and the worn-down pride of a woman who had buried a husband, lost a farm, and ridden 3 days through open Texas plains to ask a stranger for work. Any work. Cooking, cleaning, keeping accounts, whatever he had that needed doing. She had not come here for this. "You do not know me," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I know enough," Stephen said. He was standing at the window with his back half turned to her, and the afternoon sun of 1878 hammered through the glass and lit the planes of his face in gold and shadow. He was not a soft man. The years had carved him lean and deliberate, the way the West carved everything it did not break entirely. He was 34 years old, 2 years her senior, and he carried a dark past behind his gray eyes the way some men carried a sidearm, constant, invisible until it was not. "You cannot offer a partnership to a woman you met an hour ago," Anna said. "That is not sound business. That is not sound anything." He turned from the window then, and when he looked at her fully, she felt the trap of it. Not a trap he had set. A trap that existed in the space between two people who had both been broken by different betrayals and were standing, by some cruel joke of fate, in the same room at the same time. "Tell me I am wrong about your numbers," he said simply. "Tell me I misread your letter of reference, or that you did not just quote me an accurate account balance of every head of cattle this operation lost last winter to the dollar after looking at a ledger for 20 minutes. Anna said nothing. "You have a gift," Stephen said. "I have land and cattle and no one left who can read a column of numbers without lying to me. That is not sentiment, Mrs. Easton. That is arithmetic." The word betrayal rose up in her throat before she could stop it, because she had been lied to before. She had trusted before. She had believed that a man who made an offer meant the offer he made, and she had learned in the worst way that she was wrong. She folded the paper in her hands once very carefully and tucked it back into the inside pocket of her coat. "Tell me how you arrived here," she said quietly. "Tell me everything, and I will decide." He nodded once. And the story that followed, hers and his, unraveled in that sun-scorched office in a way that neither of them had expected, and neither of them would ever fully recover from. 3 days earlier, Anna Easton had been standing in a dry creek bed outside Laredo, Texas, looking at the last of what had been her life. The farm her late husband, Charles Easton, had purchased in 1874 on the strength of borrowed money and iron optimism, had been foreclosed on in March of 1878. The bank in San Antonio had sent a man with papers in February. Anna had been given 30 days, which she had spent writing letters, calculating alternatives, and arriving at the unavoidable conclusion that there were none. The debts Charles had left behind were not the debts he had mentioned before he died. He had borrowed against the land twice without telling her. He had gambled away a portion of the livestock profits over the winter of 1876. He had not been a bad man. He had been a frightened one, and frightened men in the West often did their worst damage in secret. She had sold what she could. The horse team brought a fair price. The furniture went to a ranch wife in Laredo for $16 and a promise of a letter of reference, which was the letter Anna had carried into Stephen Underwood's office. She kept one mare, old but sound, a bedroll, 2 dresses, her late mother's silver brooch, and a leather-bound accounting ledger she had used to manage the farm's books herself since Charles had no head for numbers. She was 32 years old. She had no children, a fact that Charles had quietly blamed her for in the last year of his life, and a fact she carried like a stone sewn into the lining of her coat. She had no family within riding distance. She had, as of the 1st of April 1878, no home. The Double Creek Ranch was not her first attempt. She had ridden to 2 other operations before she found Underwood's, both of which had turned her away with varying degrees of apology. The first had a foreman's wife who handled accounts and saw Anna's presence as a threat. The second needed a cook, but the bunkhouse situation made clear that a woman alone there would find herself in a position she could not afford and would not survive intact. Word from a stable hand in a small settlement called Ridgecross had pointed her toward Double Creek. Underwood's losing men, the stable hand had said, not unkindly. Something wrong out there. 3 hired hands left in February, 2 more in March. You want work, he needs people badly enough he might not be particular. The warning in those words had registered. Anna had thought about it for 2 nights in her bedroll under an open sky. Then she had ridden on. The Double Creek Ranch sat in the low hill country between 2 seasonal creeks that gave the property its name, roughly 40 miles northeast of Laredo. The house was built of limestone and raw timber, solid and without pretension, surrounded by outbuildings in various states of repair, and a pasture that stretched for what appeared to be several hundred acres. The cattle she passed on the ride in were thin but not starving, and there were fewer of them than the size of the pasture warranted. The man who answered the ranch house door had not been Stephen Underwood. It had been an older Mexican man named Aurelio, who served as a general hand and cook, and who had sized Anna up with sharp, cautious eyes before leading her to the office without a word. Stephen Underwood had been behind the desk with a ledger spread open in front of him when she knocked on the open door. He had looked up, and the expression that crossed his face was difficult to read. It was not dismissal. It was not surprise exactly. It was something more like recognition, though they had never met. "Mrs. Easton," she had said before he could speak, "I am looking for work, any work. I have managed farm accounts, I can cook, I can keep inventory, and I am not afraid of hard labor. I have a letter of reference." He had gestured to the chair across the desk. She had sat down, which she had not expected to be given the opportunity to do, and she had handed him the letter, and he had read it. Then he had looked at the open ledger in front of him, and then he had looked at her, and then he had done something she had not anticipated at all. He had slid the ledger across the desk to her and said, "Tell me what you see." It was a test. She understood that immediately. And because she had nothing left to lose, and because the numbers were genuinely interesting, she had spent 20 minutes reading through the last 8 months of Double Creek's accounts and told him exactly what she saw. The pattern of losses was not random. Someone had been skimming. Not dramatically, not in a way that shouted theft, but methodically, in amounts small enough to explain away individually and devastating in aggregate. She had identified 4 specific line items and traced them to the same quarterly interval, and noted that they had stopped abruptly in February, which coincided, she suspected, with the departure of whoever had been responsible. Stephen had been very still when she finished. "The men who left," she said carefully. "One of them was responsible for purchasing records." "Yes," he said. "He is gone." "He is gone," Stephen confirmed, and his tone told her that gone meant more than simply no longer employed. She did not ask more questions about that. The West in 1878 was not a place where a woman alone asked more questions about a man's tone when it turned to stone. What she had not fully understood, in that first 20 minutes, was that she had just demonstrated something Stephen Underwood had not encountered in 3 years of running this ranch alone. She had demonstrated that she could be trusted with the truth of what the numbers said, and that she was not frightened by what they revealed. He had offered her the partnership before she could ask for a salary. Now she sat in the chair across from his desk, in the quiet aftermath of his revelation, and she said, "Tell me how you arrived here." Stephen moved back to the desk and sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who had not spoken honestly to another person in a very long time, and was deciding whether the risk was worth the cost. "My brother, William, and I built this ranch together. he said. We started in 1871 with 200 head and a loan from a bank in San Antonio. By 1875, we had 700 head and the land paid off. By 1876, William was dead. Anna did not speak. Fever, Stephen said, and the word came out flat and careful. In the summer. It took him 8 days. He paused. Before he died, he had taken on a business partner, a man named Harlan Coates. I did not know the full terms of that arrangement until after William was gone. Coates had a stake in 30% of the operation based on a promissory note that William signed, which Coates presented after the funeral. Was the note legitimate? Anna asked. Stephen's jaw tightened. Legally, yes. William signed it. Whether he signed it clear-headed or whether Coates was patient enough to wait for a moment of desperation is something I will never be able to prove. He looked at her directly. Coates brought in his own people. The man who was skimming the purchasing records was one of Coates' men. The others who left with him in February and March were the same. What happened in February? Anna asked. I bought out Coates' share, Stephen said, at a price that cleaned out the operational reserve and took on debt I am now carrying. He accepted because I made it impossible for him to refuse without making his own methods visible. And Coates is a man who values his reputation in this county more than he values any single business arrangement. Anna absorbed this. So you have the ranch free of his claim, but you are running short of hands and short of capital, and someone has been systematically understating your actual losses for 8 months. Yes. And you need someone to reconstruct the true financial picture before you can make sound decisions about the next season. Yes. And you do not trust anyone you might hire for wages because your last trusted employee was placed here by a man who had a hidden motive to damage you. Stephen said nothing, because the silence was confirmation enough. Anna sat with that for a long moment. Outside, through the window, she could hear the wind moving through the pasture grass and the distant sound of cattle and the absolute enormous quiet of the Texas hill country in April. She had spent the last year being afraid. She had spent the last 3 days riding toward a door she could not see beyond. And now she was inside the door, and the room was not what she expected, and the man in it was not what she expected, and the offer on the table was so far outside the territory of anything she had imagined asking for that it felt almost like a forbidden thing to consider accepting. But Anna Easton had a gift for numbers, and she had a gift for reading the truth beneath the surface of things. And what she read beneath the surface of Stephen Underwood in those first 40 minutes was not a trap. It was a man who had been betrayed so many times that he had stopped expecting honesty, and who was now, in an act of either great courage or great desperation, offering it himself. I have conditions, she said. Something shifted behind his eyes. Tell me. I will accept the partnership under one set of terms, Anna said. I want everything in writing, not a gentleman's agreement, a proper legal document drawn up by an attorney, witnessed and filed with the county. I want my name on the deed alongside yours as an equal partner. I want a clear accounting of all existing debt before I begin work, with nothing withheld. And I want it understood that my authority over financial decisions is binding, not advisory. Stephen looked at her for a long moment. Those are not small conditions, he said. No, Anna agreed. They are not. You are asking for a great deal of legal standing for someone who rode in here an hour ago. You are the one who offered a partnership, Anna said evenly. I am simply describing what a real one looks like. The silence between them stretched long enough that Anna began, very quietly, to count her own heartbeats. She had learned to do this in the months after Charles died, when anxiety came for her in the dark like a living thing. It was a mechanism, a way of staying present when the future threatened to swallow her whole. Agreed, Stephen said. Anna let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. There is a spare room at the end of the hall, he said. Aurelio will show you. The attorney in Ridgecross, a man named Patterson, handles most of the county's land transactions. I will send for him in the morning. I will ride to him myself, Anna said. I would prefer to be present when the terms are first discussed. Stephen almost smiled. It was barely there, just a slight shift at one corner of his mouth, but she saw it. "Of course," he said. That night, Anna lay in the spare room on a narrow bed with a wool blanket and stared at the ceiling in the dark, and had a thorough, private argument with herself about what she had just done. The arguments against it were long and detailed. She had just agreed to a legal partnership with a stranger in the middle of nowhere who, by his own account, was carrying significant debt, and had recently been engaged in a business conflict that had resulted in at least one person departing under circumstances he described with a tone like polished iron. She had no legal experience. She had no collateral. She had a mare and a brooch and a ledger. The arguments for it were shorter but heavier. He had offered it before she could ask. He had given her the books without being pushed. He had not flinched when she read them accurately and said difficult things about what they meant. He had agreed to every condition she set without negotiating her down, and in 2 days of riding through the Texas countryside, she had not seen a single other door open for her. She decided, in the way she made most decisions, by reducing it to its essential arithmetic. The risk of staying was calculable and bounded. The risk of leaving was total and open-ended. She turned over and went to sleep. The morning came with a clear, cold sky and the smell of coffee from the kitchen, and Anna found Aurelio at the stove and a small tortoiseshell cat sitting on the windowsill, and both regarded her with the same measuring quiet when she came in. Aurelio poured her coffee without being asked and set a plate of eggs and corn tortillas in front of her, and when she thanked him in careful but genuine Spanish, his expression shifted by a fraction. Not warmth exactly, recognition again. The same thing Stephen had shown. She was the kind of person people looked at twice, not because of her appearance, though she was not without presence, but because she had the quality of a person who intended to be there. Stephen came in while she was finishing her coffee. He was already dressed for work, canvas trousers and a faded blue shirt and boots that had seen significant use. He had a hat in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he had also spent some portion of the night in conversation with himself. "I will ride to Ridgecross with you," he said. "Patterson will want both of us present." Anna nodded. "Fine." They rode out together at 7:30, and the hill country opened around them in the early spring light, pale green and golden with the new grass, and the sky was so large and so blue that it seemed like a slightly extravagant choice on the part of creation. The silence between them for the first mile was the particular silence of two people who have said significant things to each other and are now carefully navigating the space those words have created. Then Anna said, without particular drama, "Tell me about the cattle you lost last winter, the specific numbers." And Stephen told her. By the time they reached Ridgecross, they had covered the entire operational history of the Double Creek Ranch from 1871 to the present day, at least the financial and logistical version of it, and Anna had committed the structure of it to memory with the effortless clarity that had always been her peculiar gift. Numbers arranged themselves in her mind like musical notes. Patterns emerged from them the way shapes emerged from clouds, effortlessly, without trying. She also noticed other things involuntarily as they rode. The way Stephen held the reins, loose and confident, a man who had grown up on horseback. The way he looked at the land as they passed through it, not with the casual ownership of a man who had merely purchased property, but with the deep, specific attention of someone who had made something from nothing and understood what it had cost. The small scar above his left eyebrow that she did not ask about. The fact that he gave her the right-of-way at every narrow section of the trail, without appearing to notice he was doing it. Patterson, the attorney, was a careful and methodical man of about 50, with a mustache that suggested more self-confidence than his general demeanor supported. He read the proposed terms with his lips pressed together, and looked up at Stephen over his spectacles twice, before finally looking at Anna directly and asking, in the polite but slightly incredulous tone of a man who needed to verify his own understanding, "Mrs. Easton, you intend to be the managing financial partner of the Double Creek operation, with equal equity and binding decision authority over accounts. That is correct, Anna said. Patterson looked at Stephen. That is correct, Stephen said. Patterson made a note and returned to his documents. The deed amendment and partnership agreement were prepared over 2 days. During that time, Anna and Stephen stayed at the same small boarding house in Ridgecross, across the hall from each other, and ate their meals at the same table in the downstairs dining room. They talked for 3 hours the first night about the immediate financial priorities of the ranch, and for 2 hours the second night about the same, and somewhere in the middle of the second night's conversation, the subject shifted without either of them fully directing it, and Anna found herself talking about the farm in Laredo and the life she had built there, and the way it had ended. She did not intend to say as much as she said. Stephen listened in the way of someone who had learned, at some cost, that listening was more important than speaking, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment and then said simply, "You deserved better than that." It was 4 words. It was not a declaration. It was not a gesture. It was just a plain statement of fact delivered without performance, and it went through Anna Easton like a bolt of lightning through still water, and she had to look away from him at the window to recover herself. "Tell me about William," she said when she trusted her voice again, and he told her. William Underwood had been 3 years younger than Stephen and had possessed, by Stephen's account, most of the qualities Stephen had been obliged to develop through effort. William had been easy with people. He had made friends without trying and kept them without working at it. He had been the one who first proposed buying land in the hill country, who had ridden out ahead and found the 2 creeks in the pasture, and said, "This is where we will build." Stephen had followed because William's instincts about land were better than anyone's he had ever known, and because after their father died in 1868, they had no one else and did everything together. He trusted Coates because Coates was warm, Stephen said. He was looking at his hands on the table, not at her. William trusted warmth. He did not have the kind of mind that looked for the hidden motive behind a friendly face. "And you do," Anna said. Stephen looked up. "I do." "Then why did you trust me?" Anna asked. It was a direct question and she meant it directly. "I did not trust you," he said. "I trusted the numbers. You cannot fake the way someone reads a ledger. Either you see it or you do not. And either you are honest about what you see or you shape it. You were honest. That is not nothing." Anna looked at him steadily. "It is a thin basis for a legal partnership." "It is a better basis than most of what I have been offered," he said. The partnership documents were signed and witnessed on the morning of the 3rd day, and filed with the county clerk before noon. Anna Easton, formerly of Laredo, Texas, was now the co-owner of the Double Creek Ranch, equal partner in its debts and its assets, with legal authority over its financial operations. She rode back out to the ranch that afternoon beside Stephen Underwood, and this time the silence between them was different. It had weight and substance. It was the silence of 2 people who have just done something irreversible together and are both privately deciding how they feel about that. The first weeks at Double Creek were almost entirely work, which suited Anna. Work was something she understood and trusted, and there was an enormous amount of it. The reconstruction of the true financial picture took her 10 days of sustained effort, cross-referencing the skimmed ledger entries against delivery receipts and cattle counts, and comparing them to the regional market prices for the same periods. When she was done, she had a clear accounting of the total damage from Coates' man, which came to a figure substantially higher than Stephen had estimated, and she presented it to him at the kitchen table one evening with the ledger open between them and a list of prioritized recovery steps written in her neat, precise hand. Stephen read through it twice without speaking. "It is worse than I thought," he said. "Yes," Anna said. "But it is also bounded. This is the actual number. Working from an actual number is always better than working from a fear." He looked at her across the table. "You are very calm about this." "I am not calm," Anna said. "I am organized. There is a difference. That very nearly made him smile again. She was beginning to recognize the way his face moved toward and away from expression, the small seismic shifts that most people probably never noticed because they were not watching carefully enough. She was watching carefully. She told herself it was because he was her partner, and she needed to be able to read him accurately to work with him effectively. She told herself this several more times over the following weeks, with decreasing conviction. The ranch hand Stephen had retained, 3 men who had been there before Coates' people arrived and had outlasted them, were initially cautious about Anna. Not hostile, but watchful. Their names were Dix, a wiry man of about 40 who handled the horses; Rosario, a broad-shouldered young man of 20 who was Aurelio's nephew and had grown up on ranches; and a man everyone called Dutch, whose actual name Anna eventually learned was Gerhardt, who was the oldest and said the least and whose opinion, she realized quickly, mattered more than anyone else's to the general morale of the operation. She won Dix first, by asking his opinion about the condition of the horses and listening to the answer for 40 minutes, and then implementing 3 of his suggestions before he had time to be surprised. She won Rosario by learning his name on the first day, and by treating him with the same direct professional respect she showed everyone else, which he was not accustomed to and which seemed to genuinely move him. Dutch took longer. He was a man who had seen a great deal of what the West could do to a person, and his caution was the earned kind. But one morning in the 3rd week, when she came out to help load a supply wagon and picked up a crate without asking and did it correctly, he watched her do it and then went back to his work without comment, which she understood, correctly, to be acceptance. Stephen watched all of this. She knew he was watching, not in a way that was intrusive, but in the way of a man who had spent years being disappointed and was slowly and reluctantly revising his expectations upward. The financial recovery moved in the way that financial recovery always moves, which is to say slowly and with frustrating irregularity, marked by small victories that felt large in the moment and setbacks that felt catastrophic and were usually manageable. Anna sent a carefully worded letter to the San Antonio bank holding their operating debt, presenting a revised recovery timeline backed by detailed projections. She received a response 3 weeks later that was marginally favorable, which in the context of 1878 Texas banking relations was as close to encouraging as it was going to get. She established a system for the purchasing records that made skimming structurally impossible, requiring independent verification for any expenditure above $5 and a monthly reconciliation that she would conduct herself. She found a market for the excess cattle that could be driven to the railhead in the fall and negotiated a price per head that was better than the previous season by 14%, which she calculated by comparing 2 years of regional market data. She had spent an afternoon collecting from the Ridgecross newspaper archives. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done and Aurelio had fed everyone, there was often an hour or 2 before the dark settled completely in which Anna and Stephen sat on the porch or at the kitchen table or occasionally walked out into the pasture to check on something and talked. About the ranch, about the land, about the slow progress of the recovery, and then, gradually, about other things. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had been a hard man but not an unkind one, and that the family had come to Texas after the war for the reasons most families came west after the war, which was that the old world was too broken to rebuild, and the new one had space to fail in without anyone watching. She learned that he had a habit of reading at night when he could not sleep, mostly practical books, cattle management and land improvement, but also occasionally something else, history or natural philosophy, and that he was somewhat embarrassed by this, which she found baffling. Why embarrassed? She asked. Men out here do not generally announce that they read natural philosophy, he said. Men out here do not generally offer equal legal partnerships to strangers either, she said. I think you can probably tolerate the inconsistency. He looked at her with that expression she was accumulating a detailed interior catalog of, the one that was somewhere between amusement and something deeper and more careful that she was not yet ready to name. She told him things in return. About growing up in Kentucky, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who kept accounts for 3 businesses in town, and who had given Anna both her love of numbers and her absolute conviction that a woman's mind was not ornamental. About the reasons she had married Charles Easton and the early years that had been genuinely good before fear started making his decisions for him. About the loneliness of the last year that had been different from any loneliness she had known before. Not the loneliness of being alone, but of being invisible, of moving through a world that looked past her as though the category she occupied, widow, debtor, woman without property, was itself a kind of absence. "You are not invisible," Stephen said. He said it with such complete conviction that it stopped her. She looked at him in the evening light, and the warm Texas air moved between them, and she thought, with the same clear, unflinching honesty she brought to every set of numbers she had ever read, that she was in very serious trouble. The trouble deepened by the middle of May, in the specific and involuntary way that such trouble tends to deepen, which is by accumulation of small moments, none of which are individually significant but which together constitute something vast and undeniable. There was the morning he came in from the south pasture to tell her there was something wrong with one of the fence lines, and she went out with him to look at it, and they spent 2 hours working alongside each other to repair it, side by side in the dust and the heat. And at some point, his hand closed over hers on the fence wire to correct her grip, and he held it there for exactly 2 seconds longer than the task required, and then let go, and neither of them said anything about it. There was the afternoon she found the book he had left on the kitchen table, a history of the Roman Republic that he had clearly been reading for some time based on the worn state of the spine, and she picked it up and had read 30 pages before she realized what she was doing, and when he came in and saw her, something in his face went very quiet and attentive. There was the evening he told her about the dark past he carried behind his gray eyes, in pieces, not all at once, the way you could only tell the worst things. There had been a woman before, years ago, in Missouri. He had been young and certain and wrong, and she had left him for reasons he had spent a long time understanding incorrectly before he finally understood them correctly, which was that he had given her the shell of himself and kept the interior locked behind a door marked private, and she had eventually, and reasonably, stopped knocking. "I did not know how to be present," he said. "I was always managing the distance." Anna thought about Charles, who had managed his distance by lying. She thought about how many different shapes a person's armor could take. "You are not managing the distance now," she said quietly. He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said, "I am not." She did not sleep particularly well that night. The first crisis came in June, and it came from a direction she had not anticipated, which was from Harlan Coates. Coates had not been idle in the months since Stephen bought him out. He had, it became clear, been doing the careful, patient work of a man who excels at hidden motives and long games. He had purchased the water rights to a section of land upstream from one of the Double Creek's seasonal water sources, and he had then registered a new claim on those rights that, under a particular and somewhat creative reading of Texas water law as it existed in 1878, could be construed as affecting the ranch's access to reliable water for the west pasture in the summer months. The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a rider Anna did not recognize. She read it standing in the yard, and then she read it again, and then she carried it inside and set it on the desk and sat down across from it and thought very carefully for 15 minutes. When Stephen came in from the morning's work, she had a list prepared. "This is a legal action," she said, handing him the notice. "It is designed to force either a settlement or extended litigation, either of which serves Coates' purpose, which is to drive up our operating costs at the exact moment we are most financially vulnerable." Stephen read the notice. His expression was controlled, but she could see, in the way she could now read the small seismic shifts of his face, exactly what the notice was doing to him beneath the controlled surface. "He is not done," Stephen said. "No," Anna said. "He is not, but neither are we." She turned her list to face him. "Patterson in Ridgecross is a property attorney, but this is a water rights dispute, and it needs a specialist. There is a firm in San Antonio that handled 3 major water rights cases in the last decade. I found 2 references to them in the newspaper archives I pulled in April. We need to contact them immediately. We also need to file a counter-documentation of our historical water use for the West Pasture, which I can prepare, and we need statements from every hand on this property who has worked here since before 1876 attesting to the continuity of that use." Stephen set the notice down slowly. "You already have a plan," he said. "I have a starting point," Anna said. "The plan will require your input. Sit down." He sat down. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. Aurelio brought food at some point, and neither of them stopped to eat it properly, just picked up pieces of tortilla or dried beef while continuing to write and calculate and plan. Dutch came in near sunset to report on the cattle and found them still at the desk and withdrew again with the look of a man who has correctly assessed a situation. The letter to the San Antonio water rights firm went out the next morning by the mail rider. Patterson was sent a copy with a request for his cooperation on the counter-documentation. Anna interviewed each ranch hand individually and wrote out their statements herself in clear, precise language, which they each signed with the focused attention of men who understood they were doing something that mattered. The legal process moved at the speed that legal processes in 1878 Texas moved, which was glacially and with occasional backward lurches, and it would not resolve for months. But the counter-documentation was filed within the week, and the San Antonio firm confirmed their engagement with a letter that was cautiously optimistic in tone, which Anna chose to read as genuinely optimistic. Through all of it, she and Stephen worked in the particular proximity of 2 people who have built a functional partnership and discovered, somewhere in the building of it, that the partnership has become something else as well. Something they were both aware of and neither of them was ready to say directly, partly from caution, and partly from the specific fear that names things wrong when they are too new and too fragile to survive being named wrong. The summer moved forward. The cattle drive planning consumed July, and the financial projections associated with it occupied a significant portion of Anna's time. She had never managed a cattle drive from the accounting side before, but she approached it the way she approached everything, which was to find every piece of relevant information and then apply honest, systematic thinking to it. She corresponded with 2 other ranchers in the county, one of whom was a rough but apparently fair-minded man named Holt, who had been driving cattle to the Abilene railhead for 6 seasons, and who provided her with a detailed cost breakdown that she compared against her own projections and found surprisingly useful. One afternoon in late July, she was sitting on the porch in the shade with the drive projections spread across her lap when she became aware that Stephen had come to lean against the porch post 3 feet away and was looking out at the pasture with that deep, specific attention she had learned to recognize as his way of thinking through something difficult. She waited. "The South Pasture," he said after a while. "If the water rights dispute goes against us, we lose access to the West Creek entirely for approximately 6 weeks in the driest part of summer. That means we would need to rotate the cattle off the South Pasture to avoid overgrazing the sections that retain water access, which shrinks the effective grazing acreage by approximately 1/3. I have accounted for that in the contingency projection," Anna said. "Second column from the right, the one marked in red." He looked at her sideways. "You already modeled it," he said. "Last week," she said. "I wanted to understand the worst case. And it is survivable," she said. "It changes the drive numbers in ways that are not comfortable, but they are not catastrophic. We have some margin. "You do not seem frightened by the worst case," he said. "I am frightened by it," Anna said. "I just find it less frightening when I can see exactly how large it is." He turned and looked at her directly then, and the afternoon light was falling sideways across the porch, and the whole weight of the summer and the work and the months of careful, honest conversation between them was in the air, and she knew, with the particular clarity of the unavoidable, what was about to happen. "Anna," he said. She looked up at him from the papers in her lap. "I have been managing the distance again," he said. "I have been doing it deliberately, because I am aware of what it costs when you stop, and I did not want to make an error with you. You are my partner and I respect you, and I did not want to ruin what we have built." She set the papers carefully to the side. "But," she said, "but I cannot continue to not say it," he said, "because I have tried and I am not built for dishonesty with you. Everything I have tried to carry quietly has made itself visible anyway, which you have probably noticed, given that you notice everything." She stood up, because sitting while he was standing felt wrong for this. "I have noticed," she said. He was close enough that she could see the particular gray of his eyes, the same color as the sky before a weather change. He looked at her with that face she had been cataloging for months, only this time the expression had none of its usual careful management. It was entirely open. "I am in love with you," he said. "I do not know when it happened exactly. Somewhere between the ledger and the fence wire and the Roman Republic, I expect." Anna felt the words settle through her the way the warmth of fire settled into a room that had been cold, gradually, completely, changing the temperature of everything. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was the first time she had deliberately touched him, and felt him go very still under her hand, the way a field went still when the wind changed direction. "I have been in love with you since approximately the second week of May," she said. "I have been thoroughly annoyed about it." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not managed, not partial, a full and genuine sound that she had never heard from him before, and that rearranged something in her chest permanently. He brought his hand up and covered hers where it rested against his jaw, and then he turned slightly and kissed her palm, and it was so deliberate and so tender that it was almost more than she could manage. "The partnership," she said, "is not going to become simpler." "No," he agreed, still holding her hand. "We are going to have to be very careful," she said, "about keeping the professional work clear and honest regardless of the personal." "Yes," he said, "I am serious about that." "I know you are," he said, and the warmth in his voice was vast and unhurried. "I would not want it any other way." She kissed him. She did it the same way she did most things, without hesitation once she had decided, and with complete commitment. He kissed her back with both hands, holding her face as though she were something extraordinary that he had not quite believed was real until this moment. And the summer air moved around them, and the cattle made distant sounds in the pasture, and somewhere in the kitchen Aurelio was making coffee, and none of it was the life Anna Easton had planned or the life she had lost or any life she had imagined for herself. It was, she thought, considerably better. The cattle drive happened in September. 342 head driven north to Abilene over 22 days, with Stephen and Dutch and Dix and 2 hired men riding point and flank. Anna remained at the ranch, not because she could not have ridden, but because the books needed managing and because there were conversations scheduled with Patterson about the water rights case, and because someone needed to be there who was not going to let Aurelio eat all the preserved fruit they had put up for winter before the drive returned. She also wrote letters. She wrote to Stephen every 3 days, factual letters about the ranch and the legal proceedings and the accounts, with 1 paragraph at the end of each that was not factual in the slightest. She received letters in return that were mostly factual and ended with 1 paragraph that she read more than once. He came back in October, thin from the trail and dusty from 3 weeks of open country, and the price he had gotten at Abilene was $8 a head for the prime stock and $6 for the remainder, which put the operation in a financial position that Anna calculated, with genuine pleasure, as the first honestly solid ground they had stood on since she arrived. He rode into the yard and dismounted, and she came out of the house, and he looked at her for one moment across the yard. And then he crossed it, and she met him in the middle of it, and she kissed him in front of Dutch and Dix and Aurelio and Rosario, and nobody said anything, and Dutch made a sound that might have been satisfaction. The water rights case was resolved in November by the San Antonio firm, in Double Creek's favor, through a combination of Anna's meticulous historical use documentation and a legal argument regarding the prior establishment of beneficial use that the water rights specialist had located in a recent Texas Supreme Court ruling. Coates' claim was dismissed. He could appeal, and he might, but the initial dismissal substantially weakened his position, and the San Antonio attorney expressed cautious confidence that any appeal would fail. Anna wrote the figures into the ledger with precise, unhurried strokes, and then allowed herself, in the privacy of the office, to set down the pen and sit quietly with the weight of it for a moment. The legal fees had been significant. The relief was more significant. Stephen found her there and read her face and pulled her chair back from the desk and sat down in it, and pulled her onto his lap with the ease of a man who had been doing exactly this for some time, which he had. And she rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in the quiet of the November office while the wind moved through the hill country outside. "We are going to be all right," he said. "We are going to be more than all right," she corrected him, because she had the numbers to prove it. He kissed her hair. She felt the solidity of him, the absolute specific warmth of a person you have come to depend on without losing yourself to the dependency, which was the kind she had not believed existed. The question came on a December evening, when the first real cold had settled over the hill country and Aurelio had made a pot of beans and dried beef that had been cooking all day, and the smell of it had filled the house since morning. They had been sitting by the small fireplace in the front room, Anna with the winter planning ledger and Stephen with the Roman Republic, which she had now read twice herself, and the fire was making the particular small sounds fire made when a room was exactly warm enough. Stephen closed his book and looked at her. "Anna," he said. She looked up. She knew his voice in all its registers by now, and this one had something in it that was careful and enormous at the same time. "I would like to marry you," he said. "If you are willing." She looked at him for a moment. "On what terms?" she asked. He blinked. She kept her face perfectly serious for 3 full seconds, and then she could not sustain it, and she laughed, and he caught the joke, and his whole face opened up in a way that was still, every single time, the most arresting thing she had ever seen. "On the same terms as the partnership," he said. "Everything in writing, everything equal, nothing withheld." "Then yes," she said. "Those are the only terms I would accept." He crossed the room and sat beside her, and took her face in both hands and kissed her with the thoroughness and absolute attention he brought to everything that truly mattered to him. And the fire crackled, and the beans simmered, and outside the Texas winter settled quiet and cold over the land they had built together. They were married in January of 1879, in Ridgecross, before a justice of the peace named Hargrove, who performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a man who had officiated at approximately 300 frontier marriages, and harbored no particular illusions about romance while at the same time possessing a quietly genuine belief in the institution. Patterson was there as a witness. Dutch was there, wearing a clean shirt that clearly caused him some discomfort. Aurelio brought a small cake wrapped in cloth that he had somehow produced overnight, and which was inexplicably excellent. Anna wore her second dress, the better one, the dark blue wool that had been packed in her saddlebag since Laredo, and Stephen wore his best coat, which fit him as though it had been made for a slightly wider man sometime in the past, but his eyes, when she came to stand beside him, were so completely and openly present that she could have been wearing a flour sack, and it would not have mattered. She signed the marriage record as Anna Easton Underwood. She kept both names, which Hargrove noted in the register without comment, and which Patterson wrote carefully into the legal partnership amendment they filed the following week to reflect the new marital relationship between the partners, which they both agreed changed certain tax and succession considerations, but did not alter the fundamental terms of their original agreement. "You are the most practical woman I have ever met," Stephen said, watching her file the amendment. "You say that as a compliment," she said. "I do," he said, "entirely." The spring of 1879 arrived with the particular generosity of the Texas Hill Country in a good year, which was to say lavishly, green and gold, and loud with water moving through both creeks, and the cattle fat, and numerous on the pasture. Anna planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, a concession to a desire she had suppressed during the survival year, and which she was now prepared to indulge. Rosario built her a raised bed from salvaged timber, working from her rough sketch with the focused precision he brought to everything he built. And by March it held onions and beans and herbs, and one audacious section of flowers that she had planted, because she felt like it, and that bloomed in April in colors that made Aurelio stop and look at them every morning. The accounts were strong. Not wealthy, not luxurious, but genuinely sound, the kind of solid ground that you could build a future on without looking over your shoulder at the soil for fissures. The drive planning for the fall was underway. Anna had been corresponding with Holt, the neighboring rancher, about the possibility of a joint drive to reduce per-head costs, an arrangement that he had agreed to in principle, and that she was in the process of structuring with Patterson's assistance. In April, she had the first indication. She was in the office, working on the spring accounts, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, the mild but unmistakable internal signal that something had changed in her body. She sat still with her pen in her hand for a long moment and thought about it with the focused and slightly stunned clarity of a woman who has been told, in the most unkind possible way over several years, that this particular thing was not going to happen for her. She calculated the date. She calculated it again. Then she set the pen down and went to find Stephen. He was in the barn with Dix, examining one of the horses for a suspected soft tissue issue in the left foreleg. He looked up when she came in, and he read her face in the way he had become excellent at, and she saw in his expression a rapid and almost comical succession of states, assessment, concern, question, and then something that she had to look away from briefly, because it was too enormous to look at straight on. "Give us a moment," he said to Dix, who moved to the far end of the barn with the tact of a man who has lived long enough to understand what a private moment looks like. Stephen crossed to her. She told him. He was very quiet for a moment, and then he put his arms around her in the way he always did, without performance completely, as though she were the most important thing in any room he was ever in, and she felt his breath go uneven against her hair. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low. "Not entirely," she said, "but very nearly." He held on for a long time. She let him. The certainty came, as it tends to, through the confirmation of time and the clear evidence of her own body and doctor. Mercer in Ridgecross, a capable and unsentimental woman who was one of perhaps a dozen female physicians practicing in Texas in 1879, confirmed it in May with the brisk satisfaction of a professional delivering good news. The pregnancy was, from a medical standpoint, uncomplicated. Anna continued working, as she had every intention of doing, though she adjusted certain physical tasks and accepted help from Aurelio and Rosario in ways she might not have done otherwise. Stephen was, in the way of a man whose protective instincts had been successfully redirected into something constructive, extraordinarily helpful and occasionally slightly too cautious, which she addressed directly, and he accepted without defensiveness, which was one of the many things she loved about him. They argued once, significantly in August, about the joint cattle drive arrangement with Holt. Anna had negotiated terms that Stephen thought were too favorable to Holt in the cost-sharing structure. He expressed this strongly. She expressed her reasoning equally strongly. They went back and forth for an hour and a half over the kitchen table with the ledgers open between them, and it was genuinely contentious, and neither of them gave ground until they had both examined every number and argument the other produced with complete rigor. And then Anna revised one term, and Stephen revised his position on two others, and they arrived at a structure that was better than either of their original positions. Afterward, they sat in the quiet of the kitchen, and Anna looked at Stephen and said, "That is exactly what a real partnership looks like." He was slightly flushed from the argument, which she found appealing in a way she did not mention. "I know," he said. "I still think the Holt rate was generous." "I know you do," she said. "You are wrong, but I appreciate the consistency." He almost smiled. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "I would not want you to agree with me when you think I am wrong," she said. "That is not a partnership. That is a performance." "I know," he said, and turned his hand under hers and held it. The fall drive went well. The joint arrangement with Holt reducing the per-head cost by nearly 12% as Anna had projected, and the prices at the Abilene railhead were favorable. Stephen came back in October with the results, and she met him in the yard, and he held her carefully with the specific care he had developed for this phase of things, which was not less of an embrace but was architecturally different, and she pressed her forehead to his shoulder and breathed. The baby was born in November. It was a long night, attended by Dr. Mercer, who had ridden out from Ridgecross in the early morning, and by Aurelio, who managed the kitchen and the hot water and the anxiety of the household with the focused competence he brought to everything, and by Stephen, who was exactly where he was supposed to be, which was close, present, and absolutely refusing to manage any distance whatsoever. The child was a boy. He arrived at approximately 3 in the morning, loud and definitive about the fact, and Stephen held him with the expression of a man who is encountering an entirely new category of experience, and finding that it exceeds any prior conception he had of it. "Henry," Anna said, when Stephen looked at her from across the room with the child in his arms and the question in his eyes. "Henry Easton Underwood, if you agree." "I agree," Stephen said. His voice was not particularly functional at that precise moment. He brought the baby to her and sat beside her on the bed, and the three of them were there together in the lamplight of the November bedroom, and the hill country was cold and quiet outside, and the creeks ran clear. The following year moved the way years moved after the worst was past, and the ground had been solidly established. There was still work, there was always work, but it was the work of building rather than the work of surviving, and the quality of it was different. Anna's garden expanded. The cattle herd grew to numbers that finally justified the size of the pasture. The debt they had inherited from the Coates years was fully retired by the summer of 1881, which Anna marked in the ledger with her usual precision, and which she and Stephen acknowledged that evening at the kitchen table, with 2 glasses of the good whiskey that Aurelio kept for occasions he considered significant, and had apparently determined this was. Harlan Coates made no further moves against the ranch. The dismissal of his water rights claim had apparently, through some mechanism of reputation and risk calculation, communicated that the Double Creek was not the vulnerable target it had appeared to be when he first began his efforts. He was heard of occasionally in county business news, still operating, still conducting himself with the same careful patience and warmth that concealed his methods, but his attention had moved elsewhere. Anna heard his name at a county agricultural association meeting in the summer of 1881, and felt nothing in particular. The history of hidden motives and betrayal that had nearly broken the ranch was real, and she did not pretend otherwise, but she had stopped carrying it as a personal wound. It had been a condition of the world they were operating in. They had navigated it. They had come out the other side with something better than they had started with. Henry, at 20 months, was an extraordinary amount of person to have in a house. He had his father's gray eyes, and his mother's absolute conviction that the world was something to be examined directly and without hesitation. And he had, on one memorable afternoon in July, appended an entire box of Aurelio's flour while attempting to assist with bread making in a manner that Aurelio described later with a specificity and emotional texture that suggested he was planning to discuss it for years. In the fall of 1881, Anna and Stephen had the conversation they had been having pieces of since Henry's birth. "The property to the east," Stephen said. "Holt told me Macready is looking to sell the south section, 40 acres with reliable water access. We could add it to the east pasture, and it would give us room to expand the herd without overgrazing." "I saw the price Macready is asking," Anna said. "It is not unreasonable. The question is whether expanding the herd is the right strategic direction right now or whether it's better to maintain current size and invest in infrastructure improvements that would make the existing operation more efficient." They talked about it for 3 evenings. Anna built out 2 financial scenarios in full detail. They argued about the interest rate risk associated with the land purchase and about the projected market prices for the next 3 years, which neither of them could know with certainty, but both of them modeled with their best estimates. They purchased the 40 acres. Anna's projections said it was the right call, and Stephen's instinct about the land, which had remained excellent, confirmed it. Rosario built new fencing for the expanded pasture over the autumn, and Dix found 2 additional young horses at a price that fit within the budget Anna had set for operational expansion. And by the winter of 1881, the Double Creek Ranch was, by any reasonable measure, one of the soundest operations in that part of the Texas Hill Country. Dr. Mercer came out to the ranch in early spring of 1882 and confirmed what Anna already knew, which was that Henry was going to have a brother or a sister before the summer's end. She rode back to Ridgecross afterward, and Anna stood in the yard and watched the dust of the doctor's horse settle on the south road and felt the specific fullness of a life that had been built out of what had seemed 4 years ago like total loss. Stephen came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her hair, and she leaned back against him. 2, he said. 2, she confirmed. "The house is large enough," he said. "The house is fine," she said. "The accounts are fine. Stop looking for the problem." He laughed, the real laugh, the full one that had been one of the first things she had truly given him, and it moved through his chest and through her where she rested against him, and the spring light fell warm and long across the pasture where the cattle moved in the morning calm. There was one last thread to close, and it came in April, unexpectedly, in the form of a letter from Laredo. It was from the wife of the man who had purchased the farm Anna had sold when she came west looking for work. The letter was brief and somewhat awkward in its construction, clearly written by a woman who did not often put pen to paper for anything beyond practical necessity, and it said that they had found, in the course of some repairs to the original farmhouse structure, a small tin box in a wall cavity that appeared to belong to the previous owners. The box contained a small amount of cash, a letter, and a locket. Anna read the letter twice, and then she told Stephen about it, and he read it and said immediately, "Write back. Ask them to send it." The tin box arrived 3 weeks later, carried by the Laredo mail rider, and Anna opened it at the kitchen table with Stephen beside her and Henry on the floor under the table, attempting to construct a tower from corn husks with limited structural success. The cash was $47, which had been significant once and was less significant now, but was not nothing. The letter was from Charles, written in 1876 during the winter he had been gambling, and she read it in the private space inside herself before folding it and putting it away. He had been sorry. He had been frightened. He had not known how to say either of those things when they mattered, but he had written them down and put them in a wall, which was something. She let it rest there, in the resolved place where the grief and the complicated truth about Charles Easton already lived, and she felt the particular settling that comes when the last loose end is finally gathered. The locket was her mother's. She had thought she had lost it in the move. She opened it, and inside was the small oval portrait of her parents in their youth, her father slight and smiling, her mother with the expression Anna recognized as her own face in the mirror, direct and clear-eyed and entirely awake to whatever was in front of her. She held it for a moment, and then she fastened it around her neck. Stephen watched her do it, and she could see in his face everything she had come to know about the way he experienced things that mattered, the quiet and complete attention, the absence of any performance, the enormous respect for things that were real. "Good," he said. "Good," she said. Henry, from under the table, produced a sound of triumph as the corn-husk tower achieved an unexpected height, and then toppled, and he said something emphatic and unintelligible that made both of them laugh. The second baby came in late August, easier than the first in the way second labors sometimes were, and it was another boy, dark-haired where Henry was fair, quieter in his first hours in the world but watching it already with the same gray eyes as his father and a steadiness that Dr. Mercer noted with approval. "Thomas," Anna said. Stephen's hand was wrapped around hers. "Thomas," he agreed. Thomas Easton Underwood joined the world on a warm August night in 1882, in the limestone house between two creeks in the Texas Hill Country, in a home that had been built twice, once from timber and rock and once from honesty and courage, and the particular kind of love that begins in a ledger and a debt and a stranger's direct gaze. And that grows, in the way the best things grow, from the ground up and without pretension, and with complete commitment to what is real. The Double Creek Ranch ran on, the seasons turned over it. The cattle were driven and the accounts were kept and the gardens grew and the boys grew faster, Henry reaching the age where he followed Stephen through the pasture in the mornings with focused and exhausting enthusiasm, and Thomas not far behind, and Anna at the desk in the office with the windows open to the spring air, the numbers arranged in her mind like music, clear and true and endlessly interesting. On a morning in late spring of 1883, she was reviewing the accounts for the first quarter, which were the best first-quarter results the ranch had ever produced, when she heard the sound of Stephen's boots on the porch, and then he came through the office door and leaned in the doorway and looked at her in the way he always looked at her, the full way, the open way, the way that had not diminished by a single degree in 5 years. "Come outside," he said. "I want to show you something." She put a mark in the ledger to hold her place and rose, and followed him out. He led her to the east pasture, the one with the new 40 acres they had added in the fall of 1881, and he stopped at the fence line where the hill rose slightly, and you could see across the full extent of the property, both creeks catching the morning light. The cattle spread across the green grass in that particular arrangement of living things that looks, from a certain elevation and in a certain light, less like a ranch and more like a painting of everything that a life spent building something real can become. Anna stood beside him and looked at it. She thought about the woman she had been in April of 1878, in a dry creek bed outside Laredo with $47 she did not know she had lost yet, and a letter of reference and a mare and a brooch and a ledger and the bleak arithmetic of a life that had come to its apparent end. She thought about a door she had walked through not knowing what was on the other side. She thought about a ledger slid across a desk and a voice that said, "Tell me what you see." She had told him. He had listened. Everything else had followed from that, in the way that everything honest and lasting and real followed from the willingness to tell the truth and the courage to listen to it. Stephen's hand found hers at the fence rail, the same way it always did, without ceremony, entirely certain. "Good," he said. Anna looked at the land that was hers and his, the creeks, the cattle, the house where her sons were sleeping in the early morning quiet, the garden her mother would have loved, the office where the numbers sang, the whole extraordinary improbable fact of the life that had begun when a widow came asking for work, and left with a partnership she had not known to ask for. She held his hand and she looked at what they had made. "Good," she said. And it was true, and it was bounded, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.